As new owner, I am sucking it.
Just put it on. You can't tell an Asian he made a mistake. He'll go in the back and throw himself on a sword.
これはもう生物学的な問題だと自分に私は考えています。これは環境をいくら変えてもですね、いくら環境を変えて黒人を一生懸命教訓してもアジア人のレベルまでいかないんです。
I honestly don't think I brought home a C ever. My sister did once. Her life wasn't the same for about another year.
Asian American girls between ages 15 and 24 have the second highest rate of suicide.
She's now a successful surgeon, author, professor, and mother of 2 young children, the embodiment of the modern Asian family.
And pointing to successful Asian people allows you to argue that racism doesn't exist, and that any socioeconomic problems that blacks or Latinos face is because their culture or their DNA is inferior.
The model minority myth is the idea that all Asian Americans are this monolithic group of hard-working, law-abiding citizens that serve as models for how racism and discrimination can be overcome to achieve the American dream. Now, at first, this might seem like a legit thing. After all, Asian Americans have the highest median annual household income and achieve higher levels of education than any other race. But, as we'll see later, this myth falls apart upon closer examination and is instead used as a tool to oppress Asians and other minorities. While white Americans have long used this narrative to explain Asian American success, there are many misconceptions as to how this myth even came about. So let's clear those up. The model minority myth tells us that Asian Americans as a whole are hardworking and industrious and have earned their place in white civil society. However, this is the exact opposite of the narrative that white Americans crafted when Asian immigrants first came to the U.S. during the gold rush. Asian Americans have been a part of American history for a long time. When Asians first immigrated to the U.S. during the gold rush, they predominantly worked in manual labor for low wages. In that time, those immigrants were resented and viewed as uncivilized, job-stealing lowlifes. Discrimination against Asian Americans was rampant, and the fear of the Yellow Peril led to lynchings and massacres of entire Asian settlements. Legislation such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 solidified Asian Americans' outsider status within the U.S. However, this same racist history would later be rewritten to highlight the noble sacrifices of Asian immigrants who would die working in California gold mines or building transcontinental railroads. Their hardworking nature was used as evidence for how they were able to create a better life for today's API community. This narrative is problematic because it dismisses the rampant discrimination against Asian Americans at the time, instead of choosing to glorify a past of racism and xenophobia. Nevertheless, the narrative was shifted, twisting the hatred of Asian Americans from job-stealing menaces into hard-working, true-blood American patriots. This new tale of Asian American success is the one that Americans have generally accepted. However, there's a crucial aspect of the Asian American story that is largely ignored, but plays a direct role in explaining how the model minority myth even came to be. Fast forward to 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was passed, abolishing the national origins formula, which was the old quota system, one of the primary deterrents of Asian immigration since the 1920s. This new legislation, however, prioritized skilled laborers, political refugees, and family members of American citizens over immigrants with maybe less money or less education. At the same time, American attitudes towards Asian had begun to shift, and in order to promote that narrative, Asian Americans suddenly weren't job-stealing savages anymore, but evidence of a diverse and accepting America. This influx of highly skilled Asian immigrants, coupled with America's new attitude towards Asian Americans, allowed the model minority myth to prosper. That being said, these changes benefited some Asian groups significantly more than others. While the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 did pave the way for many educated immigrants from countries like China or South Korea to become professionals, it also allowed many immigrants fleeing war-torn countries like Cambodia and Vietnam to enter around the same time, though they faced many more barriers due to their relative lack of education and lower socioeconomic status. The difference between these groups of immigrants is stark, and to say that everyone is equal upon entry into the U.S. is a farce. This opportunity gap between different Asian ethnic groups still exists today. Let's look at education. Several South and Southeast Asian groups have dropout rates much higher than the average for all Asian Americans and the average for all Americans, period. While 2.5% of all Asian Americans drop out of school, that number climbs to 8% for Cambodians, 20% for Nepalese, and 28% for Burmese. While education is only one of many measures of success, these disparities suggest the success is more difficult to achieve for some Asian American groups than others. Ever since we first came to the U.S., the perceived success of Asian Americans has been used by the system of white supremacy to denigrate black Americans. For instance, after the Civil War, Southern plantation owners developed schemes to import Chinese laborers to compete against recently freed slaves, supposedly punishing them for leaving the control of their owners. Almost a century later, in 1966, sociologist William Peterson coined the term model minority in a New York Times article entitled Success Story, Japanese Style. Peterson emphasized that a strong family structure and a cultural emphasis on hard work allowed Japanese Americans to overcome the prejudice they faced during World War II and achieve success. In his article, Peterson was quick to contrast the successes of Asian Americans with African Americans. He writes, "Like African Americans, the Japanese have been the object of color prejudice. When new opportunities, even equal opportunities, are opened up, the minority's reaction to them is likely to be negative, either self-defeating apathy or hatred so all-consuming as to be self-destructive. The history of Japanese Americans, however, challenges every such generalization about ethnic minorities. This idea was applied to Asian Americans as a whole. But of course, such a statement minimizes the centuries of bigotry, enslavement, and racism faced by African Americans. During the Civil Rights Movement, the model minority myth was used to undercut movements calling for black rights and racial justice, as it still is today. Perpetrators of the myth use it as an excuse to keep systemic racism intact by ignoring the existence of white privilege, white supremacy, and absolving responsibility for racism. As writer Frank Chin once said of Asian Americans in 1974, "Whites love us because we're not black." But even though the model minority myth is used as a tool of white supremacy to divide and cause tensions between Asians and other minority groups, there are many examples of solidarity as well. Asians have been a part of the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panthers, the United Farm Workers Movement with Cesar Chavez, and more recently too, such as protesting against the detainment of immigrant families at the US-Mexico border. Famous Asian activists include Yuri Kochiyama, a close correspondent of Malcolm X who also worked on reparations for Japanese internment, or Grace Lee Boggs, who was an organizer for the 1963 Detroit Walk to Freedom, attended by MLK himself. The Black Lives Matter movement presents an opportunity to further unify the Asian and Black American communities. With the recent murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Elijah McClain, and countless others, it's especially important to stand up for what is right when it's right. Now, as the U.S. sees mass uprisings against racial injustice and police brutality, some see a chance to continue the history of solidarity and put the history of division to the side. To quote Jeff Chang, Asian Americans owe so much of their presence in this country to the black struggle for freedom. We want to be on the right side of history, and that side is squarely in fighting against anti-black racism. This all ultimately means that we have to dismantle the model minority myth. We are not a monolith. Not all Asian American groups are extremely successful, and the ones that are statistically successful are only that way because of exclusionary and restrictive immigration policies that prioritize educated immigrants. By understanding the history and fallacies of the model minority myth, we can work towards a better future for all in firm solidarity.